I'd like to welcome you to our online presentation today with Natural Habitat Adventures. We're here to discover the magic of the Northern Lights. And we're here today with Melissa Scott, who is Natural Habitat Adventures' esteemed staff naturalist. It's a title she earned through her extraordinary knowledge of the natural world and her magnetic personality. Melissa was raised in southern Indiana and grew to love nature at an early age. The mountains beckoned, and she traveled to Montana, where she received her BS degree from Montana State University in environmental education with special emphasis in the sciences. She was a naturalist and assistant director at Woodleaf Outdoor School in Central California and has worked as a rafting, fly fishing, and hiking guide. Melissa began guiding for Nat Hab in 1987 in Glacier National Park and continues to lead trips in that region, as well as in Churchill, the canyons of the American Southwest, Baja, and the San Juan Islands. Melissa loves the great outdoors for its wildlife, flora, and magnificent natural landscapes, and maintains a deep passion for environmental education and conservation. She's also an accomplished photographer, enjoys helping guests capture exceptional images of nature and wildlife. And throughout this presentation today, you will have the benefit of seeing some of her beautiful photographs. And we're just delighted to have her here with us today. So, Melissa, over to you.
Thank you, Lee, for that introduction. I am so excited to be here today to share this incredible adventure with all of you. So I want to thank you for joining me and taking a little bit of time out of your busy days to explore the magic of these Northern Lights with us. So my goal for the program is to give us a little bit of background, some historical perspectives on the origin of the Northern Lights right through today's modern understanding of what's going on in that night sky, a little bit about our program and what you can look forward to when you join us to journey north into this Arctic landscape to view this magical display, and hopefully answer some questions that you might have about how that's all going to happen. So without further ado, I'm going to just jump right into it and ask the simple question: what are the Northern Lights? People for thousands of years have stood in awe and wonder under the night sky as these magnificent lights danced over their heads, wondering what in the world were the origins of these things. And as we know, people who have lived in the circumpolar north for thousands of years have their own origin stories that help to explain these lights dancing overhead, all the way up into today's time period when we still reach back into those historical stories and grasp at what they're all about. So if we think back, the circumpolar north obviously had the most inhabitants. There is an aurora australis around our southern geomagnetic pole, but the limited landmass and the few numbers of people that actually ever inhabited that region limits our understanding and historical record to the peoples of the north, like the Norse. The Vikings of the early days often associated the lights of the northern skies with their mythologies, their gods. And so the Valkyrie, who were a immortal, warlike god culture that the Vikings revered, they would don their warlike suits of armor and their helmets and their spears, and they would gallop their horses across the night sky, and their clothing and armor would shimmer and glow and dazzle the people that were watching down below, and the people were always in awe and revered the gods for that. So the Norse were just one of many peoples. The Finns, or the Finnish, had their own ideas of what caused these lights to dance and glow in the sky, and their name for the Northern Lights is something like Renovolet, which means foxfire, and their history and their culture explains that there was a magical fox, whether it was an Arctic or red fox, that would run through the night, and as its tail touched the ground, it would send sparks into the night sky, or it would sweep crystals of snow up into the upper atmosphere that would then glow and dazzle the people who are watching beneath. And of course, our Aboriginal indigenous peoples of the north, the Inuit, had their own ideas and stories that would explain these lights that were shining. And though some of them have variations on the theme, almost all of them incorporate some component that the lights were the spirits of people or animals that had passed into the other world that were dancing in the night sky. So in some regions, it was the spirits or souls of children who had died and moved into the next realm, and they were, the lights were evidence of them playing and celebrating in the night sky. Other areas, it was the souls of the ancestors that were engaged in a raucous game of football with a walrus skull, and we were seeing the evidence of that in these displays that we were seeing overhead. And the little community of Arviat, just north of Churchill, the Inuit that live there have a fun tradition that if you're standing outside at night and you look into the night sky and see the lights and you want them to come closer, you should whistle at them, and the whistling will draw them in. But if you become afraid and you'd like them to go away, that you should take your fingernails and rub them next to each other, and that will make them go away. So there's all kinds of mythologies and stories and legends that explain what these northern lights have been all about. And even Galileo in the early 1600s, in his observations of the night sky, of the planetary bodies and stars and sun, came up with his own theory of what the aurora borealis was all about. And of course, he was also under a misconception. We just didn't have the scientific abilities to understand it at that time. And so as he looked to the north, his thought was that it was ice crystals in the upper atmosphere that were catching the first rays of the sun as it came around the earth and were glinting and glowing in those northern skies. And in fact, it was Galileo who gave us the term aurora borealis. He named it after Aurora, the goddess, the Roman goddess of the dawn, and Boreas, which is the god of the north wind. And so combined, we have the northern dawn. And it wasn't, believe it or not, until the early 1900s when a Norwegian physicist by the name of Kristian Birkeland, through his own observations and of course the reading and gathering of materials that had been written prior to his time, put together his own theory as to what was actually going on. And his theory, of course, was untestable on a planetary scale, so he created a model. He created a terrella, or a magnetized sphere, that he then hung in a vacuum chamber and streamed electrons towards it. And he was delighted to see that as the electrons approached the terrella, they were steered towards the magnetic poles. So this is like a huge bar magnet in a sphere. And as those electrons were steered towards those poles, they glowed. And so he postulated that this was the same thing that was happening on a planetary scale, that our Earth was like a giant bar magnet, and the electrons, the charged particles, were coming from the sun. Of course, that was impossible to prove at that time period. It wasn't until the dawn of the space age when we actually had the technology to put equipment and instruments actually up into those reaches of our upper atmosphere and gather the evidence that would help us to understand what is going on with these northern lights and what's causing them. In fact, Churchill became a huge component of that early research. When the military was there between the 1940s and 1970s, the Churchill Rocket Research Range was developed, and when it was at its peak, it was putting 3,500 rockets a year into our upper atmosphere to do these studies. And in 1957 was kind of the peak of that in the International Geophysical Year. But it wasn't actually until 1958 when NASA was getting ready to put the first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit around the Earth, when Dr. James Van Allen convinced the aeronautical engineers who were in charge of that program to strap a Geiger counter onto it. And the data that it sent back proved conclusively that the Earth is actually a giant bar magnet, and that these electrons, the reason that they know this is that these electrons, there are two belts that were discovered that were highly charged particles that had been trapped within a couple of bands of these magnetic field lines. And this was definitive proof that our Earth is a giant bar magnet and that we are collecting these plasma electrons that are streaming to us from the Earth. And that is an intricate component of what we know of today as our auroral activity. So long story short, it's a very complicated and complex interaction between the plasma that is being every day sent out towards the Earth in the solar wind and mass ejections that happen with particular solar events that stream towards the Earth. And when that encounters our geomagnetic field, much of that is actually shunted away from us and around into space, and it actually helps to protect us from the impacts of that radiation on our daily lives. But some of those charged particles are actually trapped along these magnetic field lines, and they are steered toward, as you can see in this image, the northern and southern poles. That is where these particles actually come into closer contact with the gases in our atmosphere, and that is what stimulates the aurora. So as you can see from this magnificent fisheye lens image, it can be an incredible display. And what you're looking at there is the interaction of oxygen gas with charged particles. So whenever you see green, you're seeing oxygen. So it is an amazing thing to witness. And through continued technological advances, we have come to understand where this is actually taking place in our atmosphere. So yes, we know they're coming into the north and the south magnetic poles, but how far above us is it? What's very interesting is that about the same time that Birkeland in the early 1900s was theorizing how it was happening, Thomas Cavendish, another scientist, was trying to figure out where exactly it was happening. And through a series or process called triangulation, he determined that the aurora, the bottom edge of the aurora, is roughly 60 miles over our heads. It's incredible to think when we're looking up at the aurora displays that we see that we're looking 60 miles above our head. But through advances, continuing advances in technology, we know that it's not just at 60 miles, that this is a whole band that goes up as far as you can see is around 300 miles over our heads. So when we're flying around in airplanes, we may go 36,000 feet. We are still well below the level of the aurora. It's the astronauts in the space shuttle and also the International Space Station, which orbits at around 250 miles, that have the biggest cause for concern in terms of radiation and things of that sort. So interesting discoveries and understandings that we've come through advances in technology continues today. And again, people often ask about the colors that we see, and I did mention that the green, when you see green, it's this charged particles that are encountering oxygen. And oxygen and nitrogen, being the most abundant gases in our atmosphere, are the ones that are the most likely to give off light. So as these electrons hit these air molecules, the molecule actually absorbs that electron and it excites it. It's got too much energy going on there and it wants to go back to a neutral state. And so what it tries to do is expel that electron and come back to its neutral grounded state. And when it does that, it gives off that electron as a photon of light. And depending on the gas and the state of that gas, whether it's molecular or atomic, will change the colors that we see. So most often, because oxygen is the most abundant gas in our atmosphere, we see a lot of green, although occasionally, depending on the situation, oxygen can glow red, nitrogen can glow red, or blues or dark purples. So those are the reasons why we have the different colors. It is the exact same thing that we see in our neon lights. We use the same processes. Depending on the gas that's in there, with electrons going through it, those gas particles give off different colored light. So fairly simple in terms of that. And what it looks like really kind of depends on where you're standing, so to say. And of course, not many of us can actually get this view, but it does give us a greater idea of how the colors are kind of spread across the depth of the aurora. So when we see reds, often they're at the top, or occasionally with really big geomagnetic storms, we might see red along the bottom edge as well. So, but how and what the aurora look like really depends on where you're standing. And this is a real good perspective of what I mean by that. So if you're standing here at A looking north, you're going to see something like this. And it's going to look like a curtain across the northern horizon. And depending on how strong the display might be, it might just look kind of white. And depending on your own eyes, some people's eyes are less sensitive to those light green colors that you might see, so it might look more white to you. But from those distances, it's going to look like a shimmering curtain on the far northern horizon. Whereas if you're standing at B and you're looking north, you're a little closer to where it's happening, and you might see some of the undulations or the curves in the curtain that might be evident depending on the display that you're seeing. And of course from B, if you were to be looking at this and turn to the east, you would see that curtain go off and it looks like it meets the horizon. And you can see why some of these early origin stories of the Northern Lights were like fires in the sky or smoke originating from the far east, or as you can see from here, the far west. And you can see these photographs that depict that. And of course, if you're at sea and you're looking straight up at them, you're going to see a totally different display. You're going to see the twists and the turns at the bottom edge of that curtain. So it really is quite different depending on your perspective. And of course, Churchill is an amazing place to see these Northern Lights. And why, do you ask? Why, do you ask, do we take you to Churchill, Manitoba to see the Northern Lights? Well, it will help to look at this particular image here. Of course, as you can see, Winnipeg is right down here in southern Manitoba, and Churchill is just a little over 600 miles north of Winnipeg, and the Arctic Circle is 600 miles, again, further north than that. So why, do you say, are you taking us to Churchill to see the aurora? Well, this is oftentimes a misunderstanding of what's going on up there, but the northern magnetic pole is not at true north. It's not at our geographic north. It is actually slightly offset from true north. This is our declination. And it is, we are very fortunate in North America that it is offset towards us, towards North America. So when those electrons are streaming towards the pole, the circle that they make around that geomagnetic pole is actually tipped towards Churchill. And it's not a static thing. The magnetic field that we have around our Earth is generated deep in our core being a nickel iron alloy, and the outer core being a bit more molten, also filled with iron alloy, and their rotation relative to each other creates what we call a geodynamo, creates our magnetic field, but it's not static. It does move with time, and as you can see, in the early 1900s, that geomagnetic pole was a lot further south than it is today, as far up here in 2005, and it's continuing to move as we speak. But it does continue to stay on this side of the geographic North Pole, which makes it so that it's tipped towards Churchill, which is kind of fun. And where these electrons come down and encounter our gases in our northern hemisphere here, you can see it creates an oval around the geomagnetic North Pole. And this is what we call the auroral oval, or the belt under which we would find the most active auroral displays. Or if the aurora is going to happen, that's the zone in which it will happen. And you can see Churchill, again, sits right there. So it's right in the middle of this zone of auroral activity. So this is why we are heading north to Churchill to have this experience. And you can see from this image, it depicts an actual auroral display from a satellite, and you can see Churchill is right there. So if you get an extremely active aurora, that auroral belt kind of gets pushed to the south. That's when people down in the United States, in the mid-states, can sometimes see auroral activity. In that case, if you were in Churchill, you might actually see the aurora if you turned and looked south. It's kind of an interesting thing. And you can see the further north you go, the less likely you might be to see aurora. So it does put Churchill in a wonderful place to view the aurora. In fact, no matter if we're at a solar maximum or at a solar minimum, Churchill is a great place to go. The solar wind is always streaming electrons towards our magnetic field, and when those encounter our magnetic field, they are always being shunted down to the auroral oval, and Churchill sits in a zone where on average we get 243 days of auroral activity. So it is one of the best places on the planet to view the aurora. And of course, Churchill, being what it is, there's a lot of good landscape features to put in your photographs. If you're into photography, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But it's a fabulous place to go and view the aurora. And when? why go now to Churchill? Well, through hundreds of years, as you can see, all the way back to the early 1700s, people have been making observations and correlating observations of sunspot activity to increased auroral activity. And what we have discovered over time is that our sun has roughly an 11-year solar cycle. So sunspots increase about every 11 years, give or take a few. Sometimes there are extensions of those. And we can somewhat predict when is going to be a good time to view them, when the activity will be increased, and our chances will be increased because of that. And our technology has advanced. We are able more and more to understand what exactly is going on the sun and predict how and when that's going to impact us here on Earth. So not just NASA, but spaceweather.com, the Geophysical Institute of Alaska. These are prediction sites that if you're interested enough, you can actually go online and keep track of what's going on in the sun and their prediction for the auroral activity that might be happening. So we've become pretty skilled. It's not an exact science, and there's always questions as to whether or not it will come to be. But we're getting much, much better at predicting the solar activity and how it's going to impact us. So we do know that these 11-year cycles happen on the sun, with a little bit of variation here and there along the way. And as you can see from this graph, we are actually still in what's considered a solar maximum, the 24th cycle. The maximum, as you can see, is we've had in 2013. It dropped a little bit, but the prediction right now is for the maximum to continue into and on through 2014. And then the next several years after that, we're going to slowly start to slip towards what we call a solar minimum. But remember, even at solar minimum, Churchill is under the auroral oval. So seeing the aurora from Churchill is your best chances even on a solar minimum. But over the next few years, we're still going to have increased solar activity from the current predictions that we have. So what is another good reason to go to Churchill? We're taking you into the subarctic in the middle of winter to see these lights in the night sky. Isn't there someplace warmer to go? Actually, probably not. And one of the best reasons to go to Churchill this time of year, which is February and March, is because it is very cold. And that is one reason to go, believe it or not. Because when the atmosphere is very cold, it can hold very little moisture. And with very little moisture means there's no clouds, which means you get a clear sky. Remember, those lights are happening 60 miles above us, and the clouds happen between the ground and 60 miles high. So if there is clouds, even though aurora might be happening, you wouldn't have an opportunity to view it. So going when your chances of having a clear sky are good, that's a good thing to do. And also, even though Churchill is south of the Arctic Circle, we have many, many hours of night. And so that increases our odds as well. So going this time of year to Churchill is a really great thing. And of course, that's the reason we're going. We want to put ourselves out there at the best place and the best time for this particular natural phenomena to occur, and for us to get out there and witness it. But before we head north, before we leave the comforts of our southern accommodations, the historic Fort Garry Hotel in Winnipeg, we want to make sure that you're prepared to go into these northern climates. And one of the ways that we're going to do that is by making sure that you have ahead of time. When you sign up for this wonderful adventure into the north, you will receive this pre-departure briefing. And besides giving you some very simple background information on the Aurora Borealis and some of the indigenous cultures and maybe some of the wildlife that we might encounter, it's going to give you some really great suggestions for how to pack and how to prepare, some photography tips, things of that sort. So you'll get this ahead of time, and you'll be able to plan accordingly and to prepare accordingly. Now, don't panic. It'll talk a little bit about layering, and of course, that's what it all boils down to. There's no such thing as bad weather. There's just whether or not we're prepared for it, and being prepared is the biggest component of enjoying this expedition into the north. So it's going to talk a lot about layering, what types of materials to use or to look for, those sorts of things, but don't panic. Don't feel like you have to rush out and buy all this Arctic gear in order to go north and enjoy this. If you just have some simple layers that are warm and insulating and of the right material, once you get to Winnipeg, we will provide for you, free of charge, part of the trip's cost, this Arctic outerwear. So if you have the base layers, then when you get to Churchill, you don't have to worry about lugging all this stuff with you, or if you're from a southern climate, you don't have to worry about purchasing all of these things that you may only use once or twice in your life. When you get to Churchill, we'll be able to gear you right out with an insulated Arctic parka, insulated Arctic pants, insulated Arctic boots, the mittens, and of course, some people choose to bring their own mittens. I would encourage mittens and not gloves. You need to keep your fingers together inside of those mittens. In order to keep the warmth there, you can stick those hand warmers up in there. It helps to keep your fingers warm when you're standing out at night. I would encourage all of you, though, to purchase your own liner gloves. These are thin, so this is a thin layer of gloves that you can stick inside the mitten, so that if you do have an opportunity to take some photographs, you can pull that gloved hand out and you can take photographs because you have finger capability there, but the skin is not exposed. So that would be one thing I would encourage everyone to do. But otherwise, the biggest part of the warm layers will provide for you once you get to Churchill. And once everybody's all geared out and we've had a wonderful orientation and welcome dinner and answered all your questions, the next day we will board whatever form of transportation you have chosen to get up to Churchill. Churchill's unique because you can only get there by train or plane this time of year, and in the summer, if you're extremely adventuresome, you might be able to get there through the North Atlantic and the Hudson Straits by boat. But for the most part, people arrive by train and plane. So we do offer a couple of different itineraries, one of which takes the train, spends 2 nights on the train on their way up to Churchill, and then flies back. One itinerary uses the plane to transfer both directions, and then our photography trips also use the plane both directions. So whatever you choose to do, it's a wonderful adventure into the north. So as you can see, we start in Winnipeg, and the train actually takes us up through the southern provinces here and up into Churchill. And we get to see the landscape as it changes along the way, and that's one of the benefits. Some people really enjoy that transition. You'll have more opportunity to talk with your naturalist on the train on the way up and learn a little bit about the landscape as you travel through, arriving into Churchill the morning after your second night on the train. Or for those of you who have less time to play with, the plane will take you directly there and directly back. So either way you go, there's a wonderful opportunity to get up to Churchill in a timely fashion. And when we do arrive there, Churchill is a neat little town. It's a frontier town. It's gone through a series of booms and busts, if you will, from the early days of the Hudson Bay Company through the arrival of the train and the establishment of the military base. And once the military base closed, of course, that was, at its max. It had maybe 4,000 people living in this region. And after it closed, today's population fluctuates between 700 and 800 full-time year-round residents. And it's a neat little town. It's got all your basic needs. It's got a grocery store, a post office, a bank. It's got a school with K through 12 and some adult education. It's got a medical facility that services not just Churchill, but a lot of the little Aboriginal communities in northern Manitoba and also southern Nunavut territory to the north. The grain elevator still exports grain all over the world during the summer months, but of course tourism is really the biggest economic boost for the town at this point. So starting in the early spring, people come to see the bird migrations. We're on the central flyway here in Churchill. As summer progresses, the beluga whales arrive and live in the Churchill River for the summer as they molt and give birth and feed and get ready for the winter. 3,000 to 5,000 of them arrive, so people come up to Churchill to see the beluga whales that time of year. This time of year, people are gearing up to go up and see the polar bears that cruise along the edge of the Hudson Bay waiting for the ice to freeze so they can get out and start hunting their seals. And of course, when we go in February and March, the bay is frozen and the landscape has changed and people come up to view the northern lights. So that's a big part of what we are going to do. But Churchill has a pretty incredible history of people occupying this region for thousands of years. And when Europeans first came onto this continent, there were 3 different Aboriginal groups that were represented in this region. The Inuit people of the far north, the Dene people of the boreal forest region, and the Cree people of the temperate forests and plain regions to the south. But Churchill actually sat in a very unique place because the habitats that these people evolved in all overlap right in the Churchill region. And so it was a natural place for them to come together to trade or even to war. So when the Europeans came through, it was a natural place for the Hudson Bay Company and of course the Northwest Company to establish trade. And that was the biggest influence. The biggest thing that happened in the history of Churchill in terms of European development was the establishment by the Hudson Bay Company of a trading fort just on the other side of the river from where Churchill sits today. And since that time, there's been a representative European contingency of people that have called this place home. So when we do arrive to Churchill, we're going to get to meet the modern day descendants of some of these early people who evolved in this landscape. We'll meet some people who are a product of the blending of these cultures of Aboriginal and European descent people, what we call the Métis, which is a French word that means mixture. And we'll meet people who have just simply chosen to call Churchill home. My friend Rhonda, as you can see there, she's a very colorful character, and she's not from Churchill originally, but one of her quotes is one of my favorite ones, and she said to me once, "Melissa, Northerners aren't always born in the North, but they find their way there." And the people that call Churchill home on a year-round basis are people who embrace this Northern lifestyle and really take it in. They love to share their home with you, and they love to share their culture with you. So we'll have a chance to meet some of these people throughout our time in Churchill as well. But our main focus, of course, is going to be getting out there at the appropriate time of day to be wowed by the lights above us. And of course, spending as much time as we possibly can out there at night. Sometimes people will ask me, well, what are we going to do during the day? Well, if we spend most of the night out watching the lights, maybe we'll sleep a little bit during the day. But for those people who are very interested in taking in as much as possible, we will get ourselves out and we will explore the landscape and what it has to offer this time of year. Before we do that, of course, we'll gear ourselves up, and we may go out on what I like to call a photo safari. So yes, of course, obviously the lights, we'll talk about photography in a little bit. But there's more to Churchill than that as well, and there's some fun photographs to add into your collection that will round out the big picture of your experience in Churchill. And so we'll gear ourselves up, we'll get our cameras, we'll get extra charged batteries, and we'll check the weather before we step outside. And of course, one of my favorite things about Churchill is it has its own weather station, and the best thing about it is it's never wrong. I always look to the rock if I want to know what the weather is doing. And of course, as you can see, if it's swaying, it's windy. If it's white, it's snowing. But my favorite is the last one. If the rock is gone, tornado. And it's always up to the minute, as you can see. So this is one of those fun photographs of the quirky little components that make this northern community a fun experience. And also some of the other signs of the time that make this place unique and a fun component of where we are. People often ask about the polar bears, and of course Churchill is known as the polar bear capital of the world, and its tourism industry is based around polar bear visitation. You'll notice that when you arrive to even view the northern lights. And they have a very unique system of dealing with polar bears and humans. They have a polar bear alert program, and so this sign tells us we shouldn't walk beyond this sign, especially during the polar bear season. But it's also one of the places, only one of the places in the world where you could actually have a jail for polar bears. So maybe we'll talk about that as well. And of course, the dog sledding community is big in this region, and so as you can see, be careful where you park. But we may have a chance to go out and capture some of the other landscape features. The gray wacky, the Canadian shield, is actually exposed here, and it's a unique part of the landscape. We'll take in some of those photographic opportunities and capture some of the iconic images that really speak volumes as to where we are on the planet, like this Inukshuk, just on the edge of the Hudson Bay. And hopefully we'll have a chance to visit this place. This is the Northern Studies Center, which is an Arctic research facility. It just recently was rebuilt to incorporate technologies that are easy on the landscape, because remember, we're sitting on permafrost, and also to be environmentally friendly. Excuse me. So this place houses resident scientists. It hosts university professors and their students, or people who are doing continuing research on the Arctic environment in northern regions. So hopefully we'll have a chance to stop in here, visit with a few of these resident researchers, and maybe learn a little bit about snow and snow as a habitat. There are lots of animals that actually don't migrate, and they don't hibernate, and they call this place home on a year-round basis, and snow is a big component of that. So we'll take a little bit of time and maybe learn about that, and then afterwards maybe we'll go out and look for some of these little Arctic creatures that stay on a year-round basis, and add some of these experiences to our overall picture of what Churchill is all about in the middle of winter, like the Arctic fox on the top left, or the ptarmigan. Or one of my favorites is the Arctic hare. Absolutely incredible northern creatures that have amazing adaptations to allow them to survive in these extreme Arctic conditions. But we may also get a chance to visit and learn from a true northerner how to build an igloo, because as you know, people also survived in this landscape for thousands of years, and they utilized snow as a habitat as well. So that's always a very fun component of our experience in Churchill. But one of my favorites is meeting the dogs. The culture of the dog team is just what an amazing glimpse into the historic record. People brought dogs across with them when they came across the Bering Land Bridge. And dogs have been associated with people for thousands of years. They were the work animals and surviving, allowed people to survive in these northern climates through all this time. And today, the dog sledding culture is still very alive in Churchill, from people who utilize their dog teams for racing or recreation, to hunting, or just getting out there because they love to be out there with their dogs. So we'll have a chance to visit with some of these guys, to meet their dogs and have the experience of actually getting out there, the thrilling experience of being pulled by a team of dogs who are so excited to run with you. You're like their toys, I must admit. But it's a very fun experience to get out there and do this firsthand with these guys. And of course, as the day begins to fade into night, we're always going to put ourselves out there as much as we can to witness the lights that start to dance over our heads. And we do this in a couple of ways. This is the Aurora Domes, is a building that was left over from the early days of research on the Aurora Borealis. It was built in conjunction with the rocket range, and scientists would sit up in there and they would make their observations of the night sky. And today we utilize it as a warm place to view the northern lights. So you can crawl right up in those domes, and they're heated, and you can sit underneath the dark glass, and it's almost like there's nothing in between the two of you, and you can experience the displays above your head in warmth. But there really isn't anything quite like standing outside with nothing in between you and the night sky and the beautiful lights that are displaying above your heads. And of course, it's the only way to really take photographs of the northern lights. And as you can see, people sometimes ask, does it matter if there's a moon? Well, as you can see, it doesn't really. It adds a different component to the photograph, but you can still take photographs of the northern lights even when there's a full moon. But in order to take photographs of the northern lights, you're going to need a couple of things with your camera equipment. You're going to need a tripod, and you'll need a camera that can have a long exposure, up to 30 seconds exposure. You're going to need a lens that can be focused manually. You're going to need to have a lot of patience and have some hand warmers to stand outside and actually get some photographs. But it is an amazing component. If you're interested in aurora photography, we have trips that are specialized on that, and you'll get individualized instruction on how to capture some of these amazing images. So I guess regardless of that, I'm hoping that that we will have an opportunity to see you on this northern adventure where we will stand outside beneath that crisp, clear sky and be swept away by the magic of the northern lights. And I hope that answered a lot of questions people may have and described a little bit about the experience in general, and I will turn it over to Lee.
Great. Well, thank you, Melissa. Ted has done a great job of answering some questions, but he's also tagged some of the more frequently asked questions so that we can let everyone benefit from those. So there was a question here about average group size. How many people would you be traveling with on one of these trips?
The group size is limited to, I believe, 12 to 15.
Okay.
That would be maximum.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say would be the average age of a traveler on this trip?
Oh, average age of travelers on this trip. Well, I would say typically our trips tend to attract people who are mostly retired in age. So average ages might be in the 60s.
Okay. And there were several questions here about how many departures you have available. I know we were talking beforehand that these trips are very popular. So is there still availability, and how many departures are there?
Oh gosh, there are, this year we do have, I think it's maybe 6 of our regular departures and 4 or 5 photography specific departures, and space is filling up quickly on all of them, but there are a few departure dates that still have some spaces available. So if this is something that's on your bucket list and you're interested in getting onto one of these trips, you should probably try to contact our office sooner than later.
Okay, good. Speaking of photo trips, there are a lot of photo buffs listening in today, and so I have a lot of photography questions for you. Let me start with this one. It's about whether you can get decent pictures of the northern lights with a small digital camera.
It depends on the digital camera. Cameras these days are getting much better, but you have to have certain features that you can utilize with those cameras. Now, even if you have a digital point and shoot, you're going to need some sort of a tripod system because it needs to be held absolutely still. You need to be able to have the camera have a long exposure, so you need to be able to adjust your exposure to upwards of 30 seconds, and you need to be able to focus your camera to infinity. Some of these little digital point and shoots have these capabilities and some don't, so you would really need to look through your manual to know whether or not your camera is appropriate for that.
Okay. And on the photo trips, do you have equipment for rental or that people can borrow?
We do not. No, people would need to get that ahead of time. Some people have chosen to rent the appropriate equipment through one of their local photography outfits in their hometowns, wherever they are from, and that seems to be a popular way to do it if you don't have the appropriate equipment on hand.
Okay. We have several people who are actually already booked and will be going in November, and they are wondering if they will see spectacular northern lights in November.
In November. Well, again, we are in the right place on the planet in Churchill to see the northern lights, and there is always a possibility that we could see northern lights during our polar bear season. It really is harder to say. The one thing that can come up is that we can get some cloudier days because it's a transition between the warmer summer months and the cold temperatures of the deep winter months, and so it really depends on the clouds.
Okay. You were also talking about beluga whales, and there was a request for what time of year, what dates, once again, were best for the beluga whales.
We offer trips up to Churchill to view the beluga whales in July, mostly July and into the early August.
Okay. Let's see, here's a good question. What is the amount of time spent inside the Aurora Dome as opposed to standing outside where we saw the tent in the photo?
That really depends on the group and what everyone wants to do. That tent is also heated and warmed, so that's another warming potential. So it really just depends on uh, your own preferences. When I've done these trips, I've had people standing outside the Aurora domes taking photographs and some people sitting up inside. So it's however much time you really want to spend outside.
Okay. Okay, what about taking videos instead of still photography? Are there any special considerations that one would need to be mindful of when they're taking video?
Well, I don't want to misspeak, but I don't utilize video much at all personally, but my understanding is that video, when you see images of the aurora actually moving, what you're witnessing is a series of time-lapse photographs, still images that have been put together to show movement in the aurora. Right now, as far as I know, video is still unable to capture the movement of the aurora borealis. It requires longer exposures than what video can actually capture. I could be wrong on that. I might have to follow up a little bit with that, but from my understanding, that is the case.
Okay, good to know. You had that great slide that showed all of the gear that is issued to travelers when they take one of these trips. Is that gear theirs to keep, or are they borrowing that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have clarified that. That is just a short-term lease.
That's good. Well, and it would probably be a challenge to pack all that up and take it home anyway. That's a really nice feature to be able to borrow all of that. And I assume you probably work with the guests ahead of time to make sure you have the right sizes for everybody.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Okay, what about bear sightings? We have someone traveling late February on a photography trip, and he's wondering about his possibilities for seeing bears.
Oh, that is a good question. I have people ask that actually quite often. The chances of seeing bears are pretty slim. This time of the year, the bears are out on the ice and they are trying to gain as much weight as they possibly can while they have access to seals. So very, very rarely are bears actually seen on the shoreline. Occasionally we will see tracks, but it is very, very rare. I wouldn't go up expecting to see polar bears.
Okay. Okay, guides. How many guides are assigned on each departure date?
Each group has the personal use of one guide.
Very good, very good. And what about accommodations? There's questions here about what one can expect in terms of accommodations.
Well, when we're in Winnipeg, the Hotel Fort Garry is a beautiful historic railroad hotel that's been beautifully refurbished. It is an era-specific facility, but beautiful. When we get into Churchill, Churchill is very basic. It's a frontier-style town, so I tell people you can expect kind of a motel to hotel type accommodations. So they're clean, they're warm, they're comfortable, but they're very basic.
Okay. And let's go back to bears, but this time polar bears. What's the best time of year to view the polar bears?
Polar bear viewing happens actually from about right now, so October and November is when Natural Habitat runs our expeditions to Churchill to view polar bears. And the reason is because when they're on land in the summer, they are somewhat dispersed, but this time of the year, as the temperatures start to drop and the bay starts to threaten to freeze, the bears start to move towards the coastline and move up and down along the coastline as they're waiting and anticipating getting out on that ice sheet in order to hunt their main food source, which is the seal. So October and November are really the best times to go up to see polar bears. Occasionally our beluga trips in the summer will spot one here and there, but October, November is the best time to go for bears.
Okay. All right, I'm going to really put you on the spot with this question. As far as seeing the northern lights, would you say it's better in Churchill or Fairbanks?
Oh, that's a good question. They're both in good places on the planet to see the aurora. Churchill, I think, has a couple of advantages because it's not a big city, and so the light pollution, if you want to call it that, is minimized, and you can get outside of town in a very short period of time into places where you can be warm and view the northern lights and get great photographs. And Fairbanks, of course, being a bigger city, it's going to throw more light into the atmosphere that could disrupt viewing of the northern lights. You'd have to get a little bit further out of town to get some really dark skies, though I think both places are good.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this question is, are the Northern Lights trips tied to WWF, World Wildlife Fund?
Well, we are the official travel partner with World Wildlife Fund, and World Wildlife Fund is always a component of every destination that we travel to. In terms of our experience with the Northern Lights, a big component of what World Wildlife Fund is doing in the region is working with climate change. And of course, as the climate changes and in some areas warms, of course, that's going to create atmospheric disturbances that could impact viewing of things like the Northern Lights. So we will discuss those sorts of impacts and talk about, as we mentioned before with the Northern Studies Center, snow as a habitat and how changing snow conditions is changing the ability of wildlife to adapt to those changes. So yes, we will always incorporate the World Wildlife Fund's work in the different regions that we go.
Okay. Alrighty, so I think we have someone who's going to go into Winnipeg a little early to enjoy the Winter Snow Festival before heading on to the Churchill trip. And the question is whether it's possible to arrange to receive the Churchill winter weather gear in advance to be able to enjoy it while they're in Winnipeg prior to moving on to Churchill.
Oh, I would say, without knowing which departure they're on, if the gear is there and available, they're welcome to borrow it early. So it just depends on whether or not the guide is there to help issue that to them. Depends on when they come in and where the guide actually is. Okay. So, but if it's available and there's somebody there to help them get fitted out with it, they're more than welcome to borrow ahead of time.
All right. Very good. Well, Ted has been doing just such a great job behind the scenes answering questions that have come in as well, and I think between those that we asked you and those that Ted answered privately, we have taken care of almost all the questions. So I am going to turn it back over to you now, Melissa, for anything else you might want to share before we close.
Well, thank you, Lee. I appreciate everyone's time and wonderful questions. Thanks for all of those, and I certainly hope that seeing the Northern Lights is on your bucket list, because it is one of the most incredible, magical, natural phenomena that our planet has to offer, and it's definitely worth the time and the effort to get out there and see it. So thanks again for joining me.
So with that, we would like to thank you for being with us today and remind you that in another couple of weeks, on Tuesday, October 15th, we'll be talking about wolves in the wild and adventures in Yellowstone. So we hope you'll join us for that. But with that, we will say good day and conclude our webinar. Goodbye, everybody.